Hi, so now a lecture on Frantz Fanon, and first essay from The Wretched of the Earth, which here is translated as On Violence. By the way, this is the text on which the documentary concerning violence is taken from, and it just chooses certain passages and reads those out and links up footage of colonized Africa with footage of actual guerrilla movements in Africa. So I think I'll go in a few steps today. I want to tell you something about the history of the Algerian Revolution, which is the context out of which Fanon ended up writing this text. I'll tell you about that in some detail, about the French colonization, the period of decolonization that begins in general after World War II, and then about Frantz Fanon in particular. Then I'll move on, and I would like to tell you some of the content that's in here, some of the basic things that Fanon seems to be saying, and then I'll end up with reading 4 or 5 longish passages with a little bit of commentary. So let's start with history. As I mentioned in my last lecture, the colonization of Africa happens towards the end of the growth of the large colonial systems. Most of African colonization happened in the late 1800s. In this respect, Algeria is exceptional because Algeria was colonized quite early on. It was colonized in 1830 by Charles X. Now, you may remember from some of those other lectures that 1830 was a significant year for France. It's because in that year, Charles X was pushed by force of arms out of the kingship. So shortly before that, now this might hook you up with Robespierre in a certain way, Charles X saw that there was massive unrest in France. Of course, we have some of these repetitive circumstances. Bad year for farming, bad year for people eating, but also in the period between the defeat of Napoleon in 1814 and 1830, we've also seen this process where new government puts itself in power. It's really a kind of front organization. It's an executive organization, the purpose of which is to advance the interests of the owning class, of a particular bourgeois sector of society, a sector that is involved in business and imports and exports and manufacturing on quite large scales. This is now the power behind the throne, whereas previously the power behind the throne had been landed aristocracy. So they first put their candidate into office and showed the population a good degree of leniency, not too much limitation on what people could write, what they could publish, their ability to form groups in public and protest, and so on. 1814 to early 1820s, relative laxity, and then a period of increasing restrictions on printing, restrictions on distribution, restrictions on gathering, more and more imprisonment of agitational persons, increase of the powers and the numbers of secret police. But as the secret police goes up, so do the revolutionary organizations. So Charles X knows that things are going wrong, and it may be that he thought, well, if I can start a war elsewhere. This is what I keep thinking is going to happen with Trump. Like, as impeachment gets close, look out, full-on escalation in North Korea or in Syria. And it's an old trick. You know, you can distract, this is Robespierre again, you can distract public opinion from internal affairs, corruption, unfreedoms, and so on by directing their attention to an external war. So this is maybe what Charles X attempts. So he was lucky enough to have, the military genius Napoleon's plans still on hand. Napoleon had thought to take over Algeria. There was a reason for that. Algeria is northern African country, largely at this point an Arab and Muslim country, as the result of a long Ottoman presence in northern Africa. And it's mountainous, and it's got a really rocky coast that's difficult to access, and as a result of these things, it had been a seat for piracy for a long period of time. It's also, if you are a naval power, or if you're a naval business person, rather maritime business person, you want to get rid of pirates, and if you're a naval power, it's pretty cool to hold territory like that too, because it allows you to command the surrounding sea. So Algeria was desirable from a military perspective, and Napoleon had worked out plans. Here's how I would go about taking it, like which beach, from what angle, with what kind of forces, bombardment of what cities, for how long, in what way. Charles X had these plans, and he simply implemented them. He just decided to invade Algeria. There are a couple details here that I think are interesting. Well, one, so this is 1830. There's a lot of fanfare as the French go off to take over Algeria. And eventually they do. They annex it. They make it a part of France, technically. But because there's, announcement that this is what is happening, there are pleasure ships, civilian ships, that go across the Mediterranean from France, filled with rich people, fancy ladies in their fancy gowns with their fancy drinks, who then sat on board and watched the naval bombardment of Algiers. Which is really amusing from a distance, right? Because it's like fireworks. You get to see all the fire, you get to see all the explosions, but you don't have to see any people die. You don't have to see what bombing actually does. And whenever I remember that fact, I also remember the shock and awe campaign, where internationally tens of millions of people watched the bombardment of Iraq. Lots of big explosions, cool colors, a lot of sparks, no vision of the actual suffering that was happening on the ground. Anyway, so the French easily take over the coast. They have a much harder time taking over the interior of the country, which is very difficult to access, very mountainous, known very well by the local inhabitants, not known at all by the French troops. And I forget what the exact figure is, but I want to say 15 or 18 years it took the French finally to hunt down and destroy all of the rebel forces which refused to simply hand over Algeria to them. And there was a leader named Abd el-Kader whose name would start to be used quite a lot again in the 1940s and the 1950s as movement towards the Algerian Revolution took place. Abd el-Kader led guerrilla forces in the Algerian mountains through the 1830s and 1840s. The French were constantly pursuing him. He would set ambushes. The French, in return, burned whole towns. Sometimes they executed whole populations of villages, in some cases by trapping them in caves and suffocating them. Which is also, by the way, something that had happened in Haiti. When Napoleon sent his forces to Haiti, they set up some of the first gas chambers. They used their ships and plugged up all the passages for air, took prisoners of war, shoved them into the bottom of the ships, and then filled them with smoke until they asphyxiated. Putting your enemies together in a hole and stopping their being able to breathe is a long tactic on the part of the state. Anyway, Abd el-Kader effectively implements asymmetrical warfare, guerrilla warfare, versus the original colonial French troops. It takes forever, but he is eventually defeated. Algeria is developed as a part of the French economy, especially in the latter half of the 1800s when French wine production goes down due to one blight or another. Algeria is transformed into a major wine producer. So the French are there for a long time, and by the time that the Algerian Revolution is happening, which is technically 1954, but really starting around 1945, like it started to be clear that there was something like this was likely to happen. At that point, the French have been there for 120 years. And so then the pied noir, which means like black shoes, that's the name for the French, well, they're not only French, the Europeans occupying Algeria, because there's actually waves of immigration from a whole bunch of different European countries. There's a lot of Spanish people and Italian people. They're pied noir. They have been living there for generations, and so they are actually capable of feeling like Algeria is their country. This is a problem because it seems like the hostile takeover of a territory is an illegal or unethical act, and that the people who do that are engaged in a kind of crime, and at the very least they ought not to be surprised if violence is carried out with respect to them. But this all gets way more complicated when you go through many generations, right? It kind of comes back to that same question I asked you around De Las Casas, which is, okay, so here we are, the offshoots of colonialism, holding territory, which we feel is our own, which we feel is America, and yet, of course, it's taken from other people who are forced to live in camp-like situations and so on. Same thing was true in Algeria, that there was this long-lived population who could feel like Algeria was theirs. At the same time, however, the vast majority of the Algerian population, who mostly referred to themselves as Muslims, although they weren't all Muslim, they lived in a radically different way than the French or the European sector. Okay, I'll come back to that. Now, the historical period post-World War II. So I gave you Arendt's text on Eichmann last, and text was written in 1961. Trial was 1960, but I put that there as a way to think about World War II and the tremendous evil of the thoughtless conformity of the German people and even some of the Jewish people to established authority and rule. Immediately post World War II is where we now start. Key thing to know about the end of World War II, I mean, both world wars radically rewrite maps. A whole lot of the way that the Middle East is constructed in particular comes out of World War I and then secondly out of World War II. Another thing to know though is that colonial powers were severely weakened by World War II, and a major reshuffling of power happens on a global scale in the aftermath of World War II. One of the names for this period is decolonization, which makes it sound as if all kinds of nations gained their independence, and indeed they did. But their independence was qualified in a whole lot of ways, and even the ones like Algeria that really do gain a certain amount of true autonomy. So 1962 is, I think, the year that Algeria becomes an independent nation again. But the period of its real self-rule probably doesn't last more than 30 years or so. And in many cases, it's much less than this. When we read Tiongo and think about Kenya, Kenya, according to him, was already, even in the moment when it gets independence, even in getting independence, nominal independence, really what had happened was that a rulership already allied with the capitalist owners whose interests were advanced by the colonial government, they remained in control. They put their puppet people into charge, and so colonialism in many cases just passed straight to neo-colonialism, which is something like, the facade of national sovereignty with a real economic and military backdrop of external rule. So decolonization starts all over the place. Why does decolonization happen after World War II? People like to say, well, because of the formation of the United Nations, for example, this like renewed realization of the right of states to govern themselves. That's sort of an ideology-oriented answer. I think the more materialist answer is that the colonial powers were largely devastated by World War II, and their military capacity to hold the territories they had previously held was severely diminished. And in this power vacuum, in this circumstance where colonial power no longer had the physical means by which to sustain its hold on territories, we then start to see the emergence of independence movements. And the first of these that's really important is the one in Indochina. So the French had also held Indochina, which was their name for what we would now refer to as Vietnam, or at least it included Vietnam. And a certain individual named Ho Chi Minh had started a struggle in Vietnam for independence. And that struggle got going in the wake of World War II because of the utter weakening of France by the Nazis. France's capacity to hold its colonial holdings was seriously reduced by war. Of course, the whole nation had actually been occupied. And what happens is that even though it's still the case that the French have this super advanced, very sophisticated and lethal military machinery, and the Vietnamese have very little, the Vietnamese nevertheless are able to triumph over the French by carrying out guerrilla warfare. What's guerrilla warfare? Well, it's asymmetrical warfare. It's a kind of warfare that happens when one party to a conflict is significantly more powerful than another, which is the case in all colonial situations, which is the case in every relationship with the United States today. Asymmetrical warfare, in this respect, it overlaps in a certain way with terrorism, or at least it occupies some of the same territory. They're both asymmetrical methods. Guerrilla warfare refuses, and this is something that George Washington had already done, and we'll read Fanon talking about the Spanish opposition to French conquest in 1810. guerrilla warfare. A guerrilla army tries not to confront the opposing army head on because the opposing army is too strong. It can just destroy your forces. Instead, you try to break off little chunks of that army and destroy it. You try to lure little sectors into ambush. You try to constantly disrupt supply lines so that this large army can't function. You try to harass the enemy over a long period of time such that the stronger army's morale is severely diminished and its soldiers don't want to fight, and when they don't want to fight, they don't fight as well. And guerrilla warfare, very importantly, is rooted in territory and population, by which I mean good guerrilla forces know the territory in which they fight much better than their opponents do. So Abd el-Kader in the backcountry of Algeria was able to survive for so long in part because of a serious and extensive knowledge of the topography, which the opposing army simply lacked. And it's also based in, guerrilla warfare is also based in massive popular support. And this is how Ho Chi Minh was able to triumph first over the French and then over the Americans. So, from their perspective, the Vietnam War, which we call the Vietnam War, they call it the American War, but it's really just part two of decolonization. Part one was France, and even in the case of France's attempt to hold what it called Indochina, it was already the United States who was paying for all that stuff. We were footing their bill because of our interest in a global geopolitical balance of power with respect to China and Russia. And we wanted to keep China at bay. This is in large part the reasoning for the war in Vietnam. Anyway, why was Ho Chi Minh able to win? Why were the Algerians eventually able to win in 1962? Why were small groups of guerrilla fighters in Angola, in Kenya, why were they so disproportionately effective given their numbers and the degree of their armament? Because of their support by the population. They could trust the population to give them information. They could trust the population to give them food and shelter. They could trust the population to lie to the occupying force, the outsider from the outside, as Fanon will put it, the colonial powers. And it's this rootedness within the population that makes a guerrilla army so hard to deal with. And it also explains and points towards some of the most horrible aspects of counterinsurgency technique. Counterinsurgency is a general word which sort of emerges out of the Algerian conflict. It involves a lie in it, right? Because counterinsurgency implies that there first exists a situation of legitimate rule and then some illegitimate factors rising up in order to oppose that rule. But of course that's not really the case. When there's an insurgency in Iraq, for example, they're not really insurgents. They're just Iraqis who are opposed to external foreign control of their territory. Anyway, what is taught now at the School of the Americas, for example, to police forces and paramilitary groups across Central and South America, taught to U.S.-friendly regimes now across Northern Africa and the Middle East and so on, is referred to as counterinsurgency. And counterinsurgency in large part has to do with figuring out how to dig the combatants out of the population. Or rather, I shouldn't say that. It deals with the problem. It addresses the problem that it's very hard to do this. You've probably heard these things, Vietnam veterans talking about how they never knew who the enemy was. Somebody who's just looks like a regular old person could the next day show up with a gun or a bomb. Same thing about veterans of Iraq. It's really hard to know who the enemy is. And this is a maddening circumstance for somebody who wants to fight a war, right? Earnest-minded American youth who just want to go and fight the bad guy. All of a sudden they can't find the bad guy. And typically what happens is they then come to understand the entirety of the indigenous population as the bad guy. And counterinsurgency technique in large part has to do with things like group punishment, attacking the entirety of the population. This is the sort of thing that is typical of the Algerian war. And if you want to see like the most famous document about this, then check out the Battle of Algiers, which shows a process like this of the French paramilitaries coming into the city of Algiers and sweeping up. I think they sweep up just about half of every male in a particular portion of the city. That's counterinsurgency technique. Those kinds of like really horrific attacks on civilian populations become necessary from a certain perspective, fighting guerrilla armies, because those armies are so deeply nested in the population, and they have to be. So you often hear that like that these armies are like cowardly because they hide behind the civilian population. Well, cowardly is that's an ideological term, and it's not correct. There's no reason to think that that's cowardice, but it certainly is an asymmetrical tactic. And what's really horrific is that the response to that asymmetrical tactic is to basically drop the distinction between civilians and combatants on the part of the dominant, bigger power, and usually the power that actually controls the air. So air power tends, in these cases, to attack civilians as well. So here's a good example. And this is a seminal event leading to the Algerian Revolution. So World War II is just done. It's VE Day, the day that they celebrate the surrender of the Nazis and the liberation of France. And in Algeria, there are a whole bunch of different parades to celebrate, but the Algerian colonial police forces know that there's something sketchy here, because independence for Algerians means something quite different than independence for the French, right? The French have been under occupation, they didn't like it, but the Algerians are also under French occupation. And so in a place called Sétif, which happened, a middle-sized town, happened to have a large population that was Muslim, non-French, non-European population, something like 95% of the town, and quite a small police force, and a history of kind of radical organizing. They plan a parade there, and the parade is to be a parade for Algerian independence in truth. Small group of police are there, and they're speaking with their commander via the phone, and they're like, okay, it looks like they've got lots of signs about independence, and they've got flags referencing Abd al-Qadir, and what should we do, boss? And the boss is like, okay, you can let them march, but don't let them carry the signs. And the local police say, well, man, to get those signs, there's going to be a fight. And the commander says, well, fine, let there be a fight. So the cops go to try to take the signs away, and yeah, this explosion of violence happens. So there had been people in that procession who were armed. As is usually the case in situations like this, it's not at all clear who fires the first shot. There are conflicting accounts, some saying that the French police did it, some saying that these young men bent on independence did it. But this results in 2-3 days of kind of widespread, they would call it jihad, war against the unjust rule by the French. And it's probably important to emphasize that in this first wave of violence carried out by the Algerians, although there's a lie in there, right? I say first wave of violence carried out by the Algerians, but that's the lie, because the French, of course, have been there for 115 years. And what Fanon is going to tell us is that colonialism is built on violence. Like that's its foundation. So it's not really true that that this is a first violence. But the event in Sétif results in 2 to 3 days of widespread violence. And what I wanted to emphasize is that, it's easy, from my perspective, it's easy to prefer the violence of the oppressed to the violence of the oppressor. It's more understandable. But we shouldn't clean it up either. This is really nasty stuff. They're killing whatever white people they can find. They're raping people. They raped elderly people. They mutilated people. Maybe, I forget what the numbers are now. Less than 100 people. But a lot of people die. But this is an important thing. The response of the French. So these are the French who have just been fighting in World War II, and the Free French forces include, military hardware of, the highest grade in the world, comparable to the Nazis and the Americans and the British. They have dive bombers, and they have naval. They have naval artillery. They use all this stuff against the uprising Algerians. They do dive bombing of villages, whole villages, villages that, rightly or wrongly, were understood to be involved in a general revolutionary sentiment. They bombarded villages from naval vessels, so 1945 style artillery bombardment at long range, meaning that the accuracy is non-existent. It's not, they can't tell who they're killing. They kill something like 45,000 people. So 100 over here, 45,000 over here. For Fanon and for a lot of the members of the FLN, the Front for National Liberation, this demonstrates the nature of colonialism. And if you might remember, if you go back to De las Casas, that De las Casas said, you know, if one Caribbean person was bold enough to resist the Spanish or to kill a Spaniard, then they killed 100 people in response for that one. You know, the value of indigenous life was 1/100th of that of the colonizer's life. There's also a similarity between the Sétif massacre and other aspects of the Spanish conquest. I think it's De las Casas, but it might be Sartre later, who uses the term precautionary massacre. You might recall when the Spanish show up on a particular island, they just kill a whole bunch of people in super grotesque, just barbaric ways. But there's reason for that. The reason is they want to produce terror in the general population, and thus to decrease the likelihood that anybody's going to fight back against them. The same thing is going on when the French kill 45,000 people in response for 100 Europeans dead. They are engaging in a precautionary massacre. Like, hey, if you continue this, we'll just genocide you all. You should be aware. And this kind of thing happens across Africa. It happens in Kenya. It happens in Algeria, in Philippeville, or no, South Africa, in Philippeville. And a whole lot of so a bunch of the Algerian leadership, the people who became the leadership of the Front for National Liberation, it's the FLN versus the French colonial forces. A lot of the members of the FLN, including Frantz Fanon, had served in the French military, in the French Free Forces. Fanon experienced what he considered profound racism when he was in the French army, and he joined it because he had been raised in Martinique, and his education had him believe that he was just a regular old Frenchman. It took him joining the French army and hanging out in Paris to realize, oh, no, I'm black. That's different. Anyway, so these people were trained. They were militarily trained. And they came back, and a number of them said once Sétif happened, it was clear that there was going to have to be a full-on military revolutionary movement. And so that gets going 1953, 1954. What about Frantz Fanon? Where does he fit into all this? He's born in Martinique. He is an excellent student, smart guy, studies philosophy. The Germans take over France. They're moving to take over France's colonial holdings, including in the Caribbean. A lot of the Martinicans young men decide that they want to help the mother country. They join up. Fanon does this. He writes his family shortly afterwards that he has made a tremendous mistake because the French don't even care that much to defend their country, and they're terrible to black people. But he fights through the war. Afterwards, he studies philosophy and psychiatry in France. He studies with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. He becomes friends with them. I mean, he's like a notable intellect. So those are some of the most famous philosophers at that time. And he also studies psychiatry. He writes his dissertation is now a book called Black Skin, White Masks, which is often referenced, kind of in line with W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, a key document for understanding the way in which the lives of people of color are broken in two, so that there's like a subjective dimension, or for example, they can experience themselves as just being regular old French folk, but then there's an objective dimension, an external dimension, where they are systematically constructed as being something quite different from ordinary French folk, being black. And he writes this dissertation, which afterwards comes to have a tremendous amount of influence, and it is rejected as his dissertation, so he has to write a second dissertation. Then it's time for him to be placed in his residency. And he asks, first he does a bit of a residency in France, and he's like, there are enough like native Frenchmen to take care of the mental needs of the other Frenchmen. I don't want anything to do with it. What he's interested in is the way that colonial rule, oppressive rule, racist rule, impacts the psychology of the oppressed. And that's the reason for a book like this. The Wretched of the Earth is about the military and economic realities of colonial oppression, but also the psychological dimension, the way in which warfare and suppression and systematic racism and dehumanization in living circumstances alters the psychology of the oppressed. This is what he's interested in. So he asks to be placed in a colonial context. Could have gone back to the Caribbean, could have gone to North Africa. They send him to Algeria just at the time that these events are getting underway. And he very quickly sides with the FLN, and really with the most radical elements of the FLN, which eventually go in for what we would call terrorist attacks, bombing of civilian areas. Fanon is actually a supporter of that movement, not because he's a particularly violent individual himself, but because he actually thinks there's no other way out of radically violent oppression than through counter-violence. It's not that he thinks violence is pretty. He seems extremely aware of how horrible it is and how it disfigures human beings' minds. But he's also not hoping for some kind of, God-given salvation. And absent that, it seems like the only way to get a truly oppressive regime out of its oppressive role is through force. These regimes understand nothing but force. They speak the language of force. They have taught the oppressed nothing but force. Only force will remove them. Last thing to say about this text. So he writes this text at that time. He takes part. So first he runs a clinic. He's sort of covertly assisting the revolutionaries. He gets to interview a whole lot of people who have undergone torture, for example. Eventually, the French government realizes his participation. He's exiled, but he works from near Algeria, and he eventually gets involved, as would Che Guevara later, in Pan-African internationalist coalitions attempting to plan something like a larger scale strategy in opposition to northern and western colonialism. And at the end of his life, he writes this book, The Wretched of the Earth, and just about the time that Algeria gets independence, Fanon dies of leukemia. This book is quite famous. It's like quite a radical book. It was always on the lists for the political education classes that the Black Panthers ran. And it was useful to them because they wanted to understand the situation of black people in the United States as linked to the situation of African people in particular, but colonized people in general. And sort of the use that was made of Fanon was to say, well, hey, look, the description that Fanon gives of life under colonialism is not what upper-class white folk, middle-class white folk in the U.S. experience, but it is sort of approximated by the experiences of the lowest economic brackets in the United States. So intercity, super urban, super poor life bears a lot of similarities to the lives of the colonized in Algeria, or if you want to think about what a colonized life might be like today, look at the Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Constant confrontation with police and soldiers, constant usage of violence, group punishment for individual rebellion, impeded movement all the time, radical controls over the supply of the necessities of life, water supplies, food supplies. The Panthers liked this book because it kind of showed that the most impoverished, the most oppressed classes within the United States had a fundamental commonality with the oppressed, with the wretched of the earth, the oppressed populations under colonial rule all over the world. And what Fanon argued for is also something that I think the Panthers supported, which was, and this will be like the last page that I read to you, an alliance between the most oppressed of the first world, and ultimately the whole working class of the first world, with the downtrodden of the earth. He's like, that's the only way in which this overall global capitalist colonialist system is going to be changed. So let me tell you some of the stuff that I think Fanon is saying in here. First of all, he gives us an analysis of what the colonial world is like. So this is like, once the French are already in Algeria, or they're already in Indochina, or the British are already in India, or the Dutch or the Boers are already in South Africa. Well, when these places are already colonized, what does it look like? He's like, well, the main thing to know is that the colonized world is a world broken into two. He calls it a Manichaean world. So Manichaeanism was a Persian religion which predated Christianity, and in it there are two gods, basically, two forces: good guy, bad guy, and everything falls on one side or the other, and they don't end up being mediated. So this is like an anti-Hegelian kind of thing. It's like it's a divided world. I always use this term, and you can see this diagram. I have it posted too. I always use these abbreviations: colonizer, so CR, colonized, CD. Their world is radically broken into two. And he can be thinking, and you can find this, I mean, this is true. If you look at the remnants of the colonial world, the cities that were built by the French and the British, wherever they controlled large populations, the European sector looks one way, and the colonized sector looks another way. So he's like, over here it's all bright and clean, and people pick up the trash. The world of the colonizer, the European sector, is built nicely. It's got good drainage. It's got bathrooms that people can use. But over here is a mess. It's dirt and it's squalor, and the way that Fanon puts it, people are born here or there willy-nilly. Nobody cares where they're born. Nobody cares where they die. And if you look at the way that those colonial cities are set up, you'll see that the architecture, there's often no sewers in the colonized sector. These are ghettos. And what's the relationship? Well, the colonizer is there in order to exploit the colonized. And they keep them in place by raw violence. So here's the parallel between the colonized world and the world for a lot of inner city people of color in the United States. The fundamental relationship, the first relationship, the most frequent interface they have with this world, for most people, is with the cops and the soldiers. It's a relationship of raw force, and Fanon's real careful to distinguish. He's like, look, in the first world, in France or in the United States, there are all these different mechanisms for control, which we've been talking about. There's ideological control, there's media control, there's this whole ideological system which is in place that takes people from their family situation into the educational situation, where they're continually told about the founding fathers and manifest destiny and the beautiful values of the Europeans and the superiority of European civilization and progress. All this stuff, these are kind of all core ideological notions which are bred into us, taught to us for a long period of time. And then of course we're also surrounded by this massive media ideological apparatus, which history has never seen before. There are all kinds of ways. And of course we're kept quite comfortable too, or relatively comfortable. We can get our our Domino's pizza and sit down and watch movies all night long and forget how poor we are and forget about the bills and the credit cards and so on. That's how control works in the first world. It's complex, and it looks softer. It doesn't have to use rifle butts all the time. But the colonial world, the way that the French operated in Algeria, the way that the French operated in Indochina, the way that the British operated in India, and the way that proxy regimes treat people wherever manufacturing is done for the first world today. In those cases, control has a totally different character. And the character now is is raw force. So it's the rifle butt. You know, that's the primary interface between these people and this world. Now, there is a bit of an exception. There are some people from the colonized population who have a bit of a different life. We can call these the colonized elite. And these are people who have been through European schools, and they've been taught Euro values, especially things about individuality, the value of the individual, and things about beauty, progress, alleged relationships to truth. You know, there's this body of people who have been, I think in the other diagram I said, they've been infected by these ideals. They're also typically people who have been in an economically more desirable position than the vast majority of people. The vast majority of people over here are mostly like anonymous. They just look like I think he says a blurred mass. Colonizers don't really care about individual Algerians very much. They assume that they're all the same. Along those lines, let's point this out. The colonized, as such, are constructed in their relationship to the colonizer, right? Prior to the arrival of the French, there had been a previous relationship of domination between the Ottomans and the native Algerians. But this particular relationship and the constitution of this particular colonized people requires the presence of the French. It's different to be Algerian in 1810 than it is to be Algerian in 1850. So just the sheer fact that there's a colonizer, that they're taking over the resources, that they're taking over the best parts of town, that they're taking over the best fields, and that's true. You know, like colonizers in Algeria said, you know, we are going to take the best land and the best water, regardless of who owns it. This is what they're here to do. So the condition, the manner of life of these people corresponds to the presence of these people. But in addition to that, so that's like their material circumstances are constructed, we would say, dialectically. That means in relationship with another thing. These two things don't have an independent existence. They're mutually definitive. You can't have this without this and vice versa. But that's the material dimension. But there's also a way in which the colonizer produces the colonized ideologically. It produces them as backwards, lazy, stupid, non-progressive, ahistorical, stuck in a kind of time period that they would never get out of on their own, overly material, more sexual than the Europeans, dirtier, etc. So these are all like pejorative terms, of course, right? And they should look similar to racist categories you're familiar with from our own world. So the colonizer also produces the colonized as all these meanings, and then the colonized have to live with these meanings. You know, even if they don't necessarily immediately experience these things when they relate to their neighbors, the moment that they deal with these people, all these meanings show up. You know, Fanon was a psychiatrist, so you want to think about how these things were projected onto whole populations of color, and then these populations are caused to live themselves in these terms. So there's a mental, a psychical aspect of control here that happens in degrading the personality and the nature of these people. Back to the colonized elite. So there are these elite, and and I was saying that they're typically economically privileged. So they've already got a certain position in this colonial economy, which puts them a little closer to the colonizer. They're probably the kids of small business owners, large business owners, managers of European corporations. So they're dubious. Now what happens when a revolutionary movement gets started is that the colonizer decides that it wants to have a dialogue with somebody. Who does it want to have a dialogue with? Well, it doesn't even know who these people are. They all look the same. They're all just backwards. They're not very smart. They don't seem to like think. They're, of course, all their racial categories prevent any kind of real connection here. But also the fact that they're engaged in systematic physical oppression of these people prevents them having any true dialogue with them. Fanon says in the end, they don't want dialogue. They want to kill these fuckers. Like, that's what's really being built here, is a kind of like population bomb. A bomb of violence that's being built into the bodies of the oppressed. But they're looking for a dialogue, so they find these people. The people who went through the European schools. The people who have gone abroad from Algeria to study in Paris or study in London and have come back and have been convinced by these European ideals. And so they try and work out some kind of agreement with them. And there's also an economic dimension to this agreement, because these people are a part of this economy. They have positions of relative privilege, not with respect to these people, but with respect to these. They're higher up. And that means that their interests and their interests overlap quite a lot, but they have nothing to do with these interests. Okay. Now, what happens in a situation like this, psychologically, physically? Well, what Fanon says is that the persistent relationship of violence, raw violence, bearing upon the bodies of the colonized, produces a training in violence. So the colonized have grown up surrounded by violence. And again, you can shift this over and think about poor communities in the United States. There are certain communities which just plain experience way more violence, and a lot of violence at the hands of the cops. There are certain neighborhoods where the local people who live there, Beverly Hills, have nothing to fear from a cop. Nothing. They speak to a cop, they can expect that cop to protect and to serve, because that cop is almost their employee. But if you're in, I don't know, Compton, and you live in Compton and you come into contact with a cop, you better be really careful, because the relationship is not one where the cop is serving you. The relationship is one where the cop is oppressing you. So the people who are in more regular contact with violence and with state violence are produced themselves in a certain way. And the way that Fanon repeatedly explains this is that colonized people have a muscular tension. Their bodies become taut. Their psychologies become taut. And effectively there is a violence. Violence is physically built into the bodies of the oppressed. So there's this like kind of coiled readiness to fuck something up, which is produced through this system of violence. And so the short story about Fanon is like, look, oppression produces violence as a necessary reaction. It's built into these people. You can't expect them not to react violently. And by the way, because it's a system premised on violence, the only thing that can push it back is more violence, and that's what you're gonna get. I mean, you really want to understand Fanon, or you want to be able to abbreviate Fanon. And what Fanon is talking about is that systems of violence produce a reactionary violence, a responding violence, a counter violence. So there's violence, and then there's counter violence. And he's saying this in a number of registers. You know, one is like, well, look, like just the way that people who are around violence a lot, they develop particular muscular and psychological comportment, which is likely to be violent in the future. That's just a natural process. But he also wants to say this system of violence, because it rests on raw, brutal violence, it can't be gotten rid of except by counter-violence. And then he wants to go even further than that and say, look, when this group oppresses this group, when it puts them into dehumanized conditions, it robs them of their capacity for human freedom, decision making, development of intellect, development of sociality. And by the way, you know, he thinks that these are the typical European values, you know, individualism, all that. Over here, he's like, what do these people really care about? They care about like solidarity, community, and land. He thinks there is such a thing as European values, and there are some things that are pre- and non-European values. This system dehumanizes people here, and he wants to go so far as to say, and really he's getting this, and there's some potential contradictions involved here. He's getting this from Hegel, so he's getting his anti-European ideas from a European basis. He'll say, look, violence, standing up to the oppressor, is the only way in which dehumanized people, colonized people, can reclaim their humanity. They can only fully inhabit their full freedom, their being subjects and not objects, if and when they stand up to this oppressive force. It's like, okay, over time, you have this violence that's built into the colonized bodies. And they know it's in there, and they're even like scared of it. They're scared of their own violence because they've been told about this stuff enough. Peace and harmony and nonviolence, and oh yeah, and Christianity's over here, right? Because that's taught to these people. And they've been told that, the meek shall inherit the earth, and one should always turn the other cheek. And so the violence that's even in them, they fear it. Of course, these people fear it all the time. Like in their dreams, they're ripped into pieces by the people that they exploit. And so Fanon thinks that this violence takes a long time historically to work itself out. For one, it gets expressed in religion. And here he's got what, if you really think about it, is a problematic view about, he's specifically thinking about voodoo, African religion, possession religions, as they appeared in the Caribbean, because this is where his formative experience was. I think when he talks about this stuff, he's talking about, he's not exactly talking about Northern Africa. But he's like, think about what did the slaves on Haiti do with their free time? They went and they spent the night on a little hillock or down by the riverside, and they engaged in these like dance-oriented, drum-oriented, physically exhausting possession rituals. And Fanon's, I think, rather dismissive and Eurocentric evaluation of that is that that's just physically a way of working that violence out. You feel like all tensed up and like ready to like kill somebody, but you dance all night and then it goes away. We probably have a whole bunch of things like that. I mean, you could fit drug use in there. Like drug use is like one avenue that oppressed people take. And in this respect, you can see that oppressed people are not just people of color in the United States, but think about the whole wide opiate epidemic through the Midwest. That involves a whole lot of white people too. Impoverished people who have been dehumanized. There's an anger built into their body, and that anger can be dealt with by like religion, or I'm adding right now, drugs. He's like, but then another thing happens too, and that is like, maybe you can call it black on black violence, although we could expand it, or Muslim on Muslim violence, or Algerian on Algerian violence. And this, of course, this happens in American communities too, that people are so pent up, and we're going to read about this a lot with, like, especially say like James Baldwin. He's going to tell us like the fundamental problem of living in an American ghetto is the sense that you will never go anywhere. And your children will never go anywhere, that you are stuck. That feeling of being stuck, as well as that regular encounter with like actual force, produces this muscular anger in these bodies. But nobody wants to deal with what they really have to deal with. What needs dealt with is the whole structure. It's the fact that there is this outsider class, this dominating class, and that you are not in it, and that they control the cops, and they control the money, and they control the resources. That's the problem. The system is the problem. But it's hard to deal with that. I mean, like, what does that mean you have to do? It means you have to risk your life and organize yourself for revolution. Nobody wants to do that right away. They'd rather it were easier. And so they turn this anger on one another over the slightest thing. And Fanon says, I've seen Algerian Muslims beaten by cops, never like lift a finger or say a word. But like the slightest insult from one of their neighbors and they stick a knife in them. Why? Because this violence has been produced by this system and it is presently misdirected. But eventually, people start to wake up. And when they start to wake up, they start to realize, that's no good. That's a tragic waste of our force. Let's get rid of religion. Let's stop thinking mystically. Let's stop thinking in terms of gang violence or Bloods and Crips. On this model, the Bloods and the Crips, they have to become politicized and become one group. As in fact, if you look historically, they sort of were. We'll call that it for now. And then I'm just going to finish up. It's probably going to take me another 20 minutes or something. I want to read you a number of passages, and they're kind of long, but I think this is a beautiful book, so it's worth checking out. Okay, I'm going to read from the bottom of page 10 through page 11 and on to page 12, I think. Wherever an authentic liberation struggle has been fought, wherever the blood of the people has been shed, and the armed phase has lasted long enough to encourage the intellectuals to withdraw to their rank-and-file base, there is an effective eradication of the superstructure borrowed by these intellectuals from the colonialist bourgeois circles. So what he's saying is, once things get reduced to relationships of violence, this like tentative agreement between a special subset of the colonized and the colonizers, the ones who spoke the language, literally spoke, French or spoke English, but also like shared the values that they'd been taught in school, this alliance breaks down. And either these people get killed or pushed out of the country, or they retreat back to the base. They become a part of this group. And this is, in large part, how Fanon understands himself, right? Because Fanon is the colonized elite. And they start dropping these values. In its narcissistic monologue, the colonialist bourgeoisie, by way of its academics, had implanted in the minds of the colonized that the essential values, meaning Western values, remain eternal despite all errors attributable to man. The colonized intellectual accepted the cogency of these ideas, and there in the back of his mind stood a sentinel on duty, guarding the Greco-Roman pedestal. So here he's referring to the humanistic tradition that the European colonial nations refer to, by which to explain themselves as being eternal and progressive and different from the rest of the world, the Greco-Roman history. But during the struggle for liberation, when the colonized intellectual touches base again with his people, this artificial sentinel is smashed to smithereens. All the Mediterranean values, the triumph of the individual, of enlightenment and beauty, turn into pale, lifeless trinkets. All those discourses appear a jumble of dead words. Those values, which seem to ennoble the soul, prove worthless because they have nothing in common with the real-life struggle in which the people are engaged. And first among them is individualism. The colonized individual learned from his masters that the individual must assert himself. The colonized intellectual. The colonialist bourgeoisie hammered into the colonized mind the notion of a society of individuals where each is locked in his subjectivity, where wealth lies in thought. But the colonized intellectual, who is lucky enough to bunker down with the people during the liberation struggle, will soon discover the falsity of this theory. Involvement in the organization of the struggle will already introduce him to a different vocabulary. Brother, sister, comrade, are words outlawed by the colonialist bourgeoisie because in their thinking, my brother is my wallet, and my comrade, my scheming. In a kind of auto-da-fe, the colonized, that means like self-immolation, the colonized intellectual witnesses the destruction of all his idols, egoism, arrogant recrimination, and the idiotic, childish need to have the last word. That's how he's been raised to be. This colonized intellectual, pulverized by colonialist culture, will also discover the strength of the village assemblies. So remember that's kind of a reference to the council structure that we've been talking about. The power of the people's commissions and the extraordinary productiveness of neighborhood and section committee meetings. So this is a revolutionary structure similar to what Hannah Arendt says existed in the American and the French revolutions. We have local, autonomous, self-governing councils. Personal interests are now the collective interest, because in reality everyone will be discovered by the French legionnaires and consequently massacred, or else everyone will be saved. In such a context, the every man for himself concept, the atheist's form of salvation, is prohibited. Okay, page 24 to 26, another long one. This notion of compromise is very important in the case of decolonization, for it is far from being a simple matter. Compromise, in fact, involves both the colonial system and the burgeoning national bourgeoisie. The adherents of the colonial system discovered that the masses might very well destroy everything. The sabotage of bridges, the destruction of farms, repression, and war can severely disrupt the economy. Compromise is also on the agenda for the national bourgeoisie, who, unable to foresee the possible consequences of such a whirlwind, fear in fact they will be swept away, and hasten to reassure the colonists. We are still capable of stopping the slaughter. The masses still trust us. Act quickly if you do not want to jeopardize everything. So this is the process that I was talking about. Like the colonizers want to have a relationship with the colonized. They start this discussion, and they're really, these people are out to maintain their superiority over these ones, but this is a passing phase. He loudly claims he has nothing to do with these Mau Mau. with these terrorists, and we'll talk about the Mau Mau when we get to Tiongo and Kenya, these butchers. In the best of cases, he barricades himself in a no man's land between the terrorists and the colonists and offers his services as mediator, quote unquote, which means that since the colonists cannot negotiate with the Mau Mau, he himself is prepared to begin negotiations. Thus, the rear guard of the national struggle, that section of the people who have always been on the other side, now find themselves catapulted to the forefront of negotiations and to compromise, precisely because they have always been careful not to break ties with colonialism. Before holding negotiations, most of the nationalist parties are content in the best of cases to explain and excuse this savagery. They distance themselves from the people's struggle and can often be heard in private condemning those spectacular acts that have been decreed heinous by the metropolitan press and public opinion. That means the media apparatus over here. Their preoccupation with objectivity constitutes the legitimate excuse for their failure to act. So these people want to think that they're allied with this real revolutionary portion of the population, but they're actually a brake upon it. Who is it? One of the writers that we're going to read before the end of class will say a very similar thing about liberals. You know, the white liberals are like a big part of the problem, because they think that they're on the side of the oppressed, but they're not actually willing to do anything about it. They're always like, insisting, we should do things non-violently. We should compromise. We should negotiate with the other classes. And the problem is that this is not a negotiable situation. This is suffering and violence, and it's going to require a massive uprising that will kill or run off all of these parasitical people. But this classic attitude of the colonized intellectual and the leaders of the nationalist parties is by no means objective. In fact, they are not sure this reckless violence is the most effective way of defending their own interests. That's what they're concerned about. Another thing is that they are convinced violent methods are ineffective. For them, there can be no doubt any attempt to smash colonial oppression by force is an act of despair, a suicidal act. So they're convinced immediately these people are too powerful and there's nothing we could do against them. I read this passage in part because I know this is like, what you're likely to tell me is like, well, in our case, it's impossible because the government, the state forces is too powerful. And Fanon's like, well, that's just defeatist thinking is what that is. Because the colonizers' tanks and fighter planes are constantly on their minds, when they are told we must act, they imagine bombs being dropped, armored cars rumbling through the streets, a hail of bullets, the police, and they stay put. They are losers from the start. Their incapacity to triumph by violence needs no demonstration. They prove it in their daily life and their maneuvering. They have remained in the puerile position which Engels adopted in his famous argument with that mountain of puerility, Monsieur Düring. Okay, so here's Engels making a claim about how wars can be won, and then here's Fanon responding like, oh wait, no, you're forgetting about guerrilla warfare. So here's Engels giving a view on traditional warfare. Who's going to win traditional's not quite the word, conventional warfare between two relatively similar powers. And then Fanon is going to respond by talking about guerrilla warfare. Here's Engels. Just as Robinson Crusoe, could procure a sword for himself, we are equally entitled to assume that one fine morning Friday, and Friday was the person who ended up being the servant of Robinson Crusoe, might appear with a loaded revolver in his hand, and then the whole force relationship is inverted. Friday commands, and it is Crusoe who has to drudge. So then, the revolver triumphs over the sword. And this will probably make even the most childish axiomatician comprehend that force is no mere act of the will, but requires very real preliminary conditions before it can come into operation. That is to say, instruments, the more perfect of which vanquish the less perfect. Moreover, that these instruments have to be produced, which also implies that the producer of more perfect instruments of force, vulgo arms, vanquishes the producer of the less perfect instrument, and that, in a word, the triumph of force is based on the production of arms, and this in turn on production in general. Therefore on economic power, on the economic order, on the material means which force has at its disposal. This is the kind of thing that becomes really clear. I mean, it's kind of a lot of foresight for Engels. It's the kind of thing that becomes really clear in like World War I and World War II, where making war and stepping up your economic base to just manufacture more armaments ended up being the same thing. And those world wars ended up being a sort of competitive, productive challenge between arms-making nations about who could make the most. And in a lot of ways, the United States wins. And it wins not just because we're more capable, but it wins because we're also not getting the shit bombed out of us. Oh, and by the way, there is another point that I would derive from that, which is that, violence depends upon the construction of implements of violence. So you can get something like an argument for arms control out of there. Like if there are more guns around, the possibility of violence goes up. If less, less. Anyway, so here's Fanon responding. In fact, the reformist leaders say the same thing. So there's this big opposition between reform and revolution, right? What do you expect to fight the colonists with? With your knives? With shotguns? Yes, instruments are important in the field of violence, since in the end, everything is based on the allocation of these instruments of force. But in this respect, it so happens that the liberation of colonial territories sheds new light on the matter. For example, during the Peninsular War, which was an authentic colonial war, Napoleon was forced to retreat despite having mustered the massive figure of 400,000 men during the 1810 Spring Offensive. So the Peninsular War, the peninsula is Spain. So French Napoleonic forces entered Spain, toppled the government there, but encountered a massive amount of resistance from a sort of proto-anarchist organization. Yet the French army's instruments of war, the bravery of its soldiers, and the military genius of its leaders made the whole of Europe tremble. Confronted with the enormous resources of the Napoleonic army, the Spanish, buoyed by an unshakable national fervor, discovered guerrilla warfare, which 25 years earlier the American militia had tested on the British troops. But guerrilla warfare, that instrument of violence of the colonized, would amount to nothing if it did not count as a new factor in the global competition between cartels and monopolies. Okay, let's skip way forward. Page 46. Okay, so how the life of the colonized changes once they go into the phase of full-on armed struggle. Like, in a way, Fanon thinks that this is a purifying process. It is understandable how, in such an atmosphere, everyday life becomes impossible. Being a fellow, a pimp, or an alcoholic is no longer an option. The violence of the colonial regime and the counter-violence of the colonized balance each other and respond to each other in an extraordinary reciprocal homogeneity. So violence and counter-violence. Again, check out the Battle of Algiers if you want to see this like just graphed out for you. The greater the number of metropolitan settlers, the more terrible the violence will be. Violence among the colonized will spread in proportion to the violence exerted by the colonial regime. In the initial phase of this insurrectional period, the metropolitan governments are slaves of the colonists. These colonists are a threat to both the colonized and their own governments. They will use the same methods indiscriminately. The assassination of the mayor of Evian can be likened to the assassination of Ali Boumediene in its method and motivation. For the colonists, the alternative is not between an Algerian Algeria and a French Algeria, but between an independent Algeria and a colonial Algeria. Anything else is hot air or an act of treason. The colonists' logic is unrelenting, and one is only baffled by the counter-logic of the colonized's behavior if one has remained out of touch with the colonists' way of thinking. Once the colonized have opted for counter-violence, police reprisals automatically call for reprisals by the nationalist forces. The outcome, however, is profoundly unequal, for machine gunning by planes or bombardments from naval vessels outweigh in horror and scope the response from the colonized. So that's a direct reference to the Sétif massacre that I told you about. Oh, and by the way, my source for that history of the Algerian conflict is a really good book that I used to use in this class by a guy named Horn, Alistair Horn, Horne. The most alienated of the colonized are once and for all demystified by this pendulum motion of terror and counter-terror. They see for themselves that any number of speeches on human equality cannot mask the absurdity whereby 7 Frenchmen killed or wounded in an ambush at the Sakamoti Pass sparks the indignation of civilized consciences, whereas the sacking of the Gorger Douars, the Gera Decra, and the massacre of the population behind the ambush count for nothing. So I won't give you the details about those references, but the point is that think about like how the northern or the western media works. Like we always see, so we saw recently that 4 American special forces were killed in Niger, and there's a public outcry, but of course the media never covers anything about the untold hundreds and thousands of people that are killed on a regular basis by or in collaboration with American special forces, right? And there's like a deep and violent racism carried out by that selective visibility and invisibility, making the destruction of thousands of oppressed people invisible is an aspect of killing them. It's one way in which that killing is facilitated and is allowed to continue. Terror, counter-terror, violence, counter-violence. This is what observers bitterly report when describing the circle of hatred which is so manifest and so tenacious in Algeria. Page 54. The apotheosis of independence becomes the curse of independence. The sweeping powers of coercion of the colonial authorities condemn the young nation to regression. In other words, so now we're moving towards independence, and Fanon wants to think through what happens at independence. And the reason that independence is by no means the end of the road. Decolonization does not triumph at independence. In fact, it just encounters a new level of struggle. This is also what happened to Haiti, right? Haiti gained independence, but it was kept and has been kept as an effectively third world nation from that point to this one by the economic powers that surround it. In other words, the colonial power says, if you want independence, take it and suffer the consequences. The nationalist leaders then are left with no other choice but to turn to their people and ask them to make a gigantic effort. These famished individuals are required to undergo a regime of austerity. These atrophied muscles are required to work out of all proportion. An autarkic regime is established, and each state, with the pitiful resources at its disposal, endeavors to address the mounting national hunger and the growing national poverty. We are witness to the mobilization of a people who now have to work themselves to exhaustion, while a contemptuous and bloated Europe looks on. Other third world countries refuse to accept such an ordeal and agree to give in to the terms of the former colonial power. So the question that is being asked here is like, okay, so this is Cold War, right? So you have the US and capitalist powers on one side, the USSR and communist powers on the other side. And one way for a newly independent nation to bolster itself, to get economic aid, and it needs this, one way is to side with one of those things. Why does it need all this aid? Well, because once the colonial power is forced out or decides to cut its losses and back out, it also pulls out all of its technicians, everybody who knows how to run machinery and service things, and all of its capital. So all kinds of stuff comes to a standstill. And now the new independent nation is sort of like lost, like, oh no, what do we do now? How are we going to feed our population? And so one option is to side with the Americans or with the Russians. Fanon actually thinks that neutrality is necessary, but he's also very pragmatic, and he's like, neutrality probably won't work by itself. Other third world countries refuse to accept such an ordeal and agree to give in to the terms of the former colonial power. Taking advantage of their strategic position in the Cold War struggle, these countries sign agreements and commit themselves. The formerly colonized territory is now turned into an economically dependent country. The former colonizer, which has kept intact and in some cases reinforced its colonial marketing channels, agrees to inject small doses into the independent nation's budget in order to sustain it. Now that the colonial countries have achieved their independence, the world is faced with the bare facts that make the actual state of the liberated countries even more intolerable. The basic confrontation, which seems to be colonialism versus anti-colonialism, indeed capitalism versus socialism, is already losing its importance. What matters today, the issue which blocks the horizon, is the need for a redistribution of wealth. Humanity will have to address this question, no matter how devastating the consequences may be. I give you these texts because I think they're beautiful and powerful, and a lot of it I agree with, and this one in particular, you know, that statement. So that's like 1962. So that's what, like 55 years ago? 55 years ago, Fanon was able to say, what matters today, the issue which blocks the horizon, is the need for a redistribution of wealth. Humanity will have to address this question no matter how devastating the consequences may be. I think that's still true today. Page 57. Okay, so he's like working through, like, you know, what kinds of negotiations, and then he gives his position. The truth is, we must not accept such conditions. We must refuse outright the situation to which the West wants to condemn us. Colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn their flag and their police force from our territories. For centuries, the capitalists have behaved like real war criminals in the underdeveloped world. Deportation, massacres, forced labor, and slavery were the primary methods used by capitalism to increase its gold and diamond reserves and establish its wealth and power. Not so long ago, Nazism transformed the whole of Europe into a genuine colony. The governments of various European nations demanded reparations and the restitution in money and kind for their stolen treasures. As a result, cultural artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows were returned to their owners. In the aftermath of the war, the Europeans were adamant about one thing: Germany will pay. At the opening of the Eichmann trial, Mr. Adenauer, on behalf of the German people, once again asked forgiveness from the Jewish people. Mr. Adenauer renewed his country's commitment to continue paying enormous sums to the State of Israel to compensate for Nazi crimes. So Germany, because it colonized France, for example, and stole all kinds of shit, when it was defeated, it had to pay all that stuff back. And what Fanon is saying is that the third world, the colonized world, when it achieves independence, has every right, and actually it has the right before it achieves independence, just like France had the right even when it was under German occupation, to demand that the oppression end, and that everything that's been stolen should be given back. That's justice. So he's talking about reparations. Europe needs to make reparations to Africa, to the whole of the third world, because if it doesn't, it continues to exist in a superior position, a privileged position, and a position which allows it to continue to exploit the rest of the world. And yet, just as is the case with capitalists, whose money is generated by those who work for them, Europe has its wealth because it took that wealth from the third world. So it doesn't belong to Europe. Europe's ascendancy is actually produced by the blood of the third world. The most eloquent expressions of this stuff, I think, are in Aimé Césaire, who's a poet from Martinique, so Fanon's countryman. Last semester, it's kind of dense language, but quite beautiful. He wrote this book called Notebook of a Return to My Native Land, where he talks about this stuff. At the same time, we are of the opinion that the imperialist states would be making a serious mistake and committing an unspeakable injustice if they were content to withdraw from our soil the military cohorts and the administrative and financial services whose job it was to prospect for, extract, and ship our wealth to the metropolis. Moral reparation for national independence does not fool us, and it doesn't feed us. The wealth of the imperialist nations is also our wealth. At a universal level, such a statement in no way means we feel implicated in the technical feats or artistic creations of the West. In concrete terms, Europe has been bloated out of all proportions by the gold and raw materials from such colonial countries as Latin America, China, and Africa. Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces these continents. For centuries, the point of departure of their shipments of diamonds, oil, silk and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The riches which are choking it are those plundered from the underdeveloped peoples. The ports of Holland, the docks in Bordeaux and Liverpool owe their importance to the trade and deportation of millions of slaves. And when we hear the head of a European nation declare with hand on heart that he must come to the aid of the unfortunate peoples of the underdeveloped world, we do not tremble with gratitude. On the contrary, we say among ourselves, it is a just reparation we are getting. So we will not accept aid for the underdeveloped countries as charity. Such aid must be considered the final stage of a dual consciousness. The consciousness of the colonized that it is their due, and the consciousness of the capitalist powers that effectively they must pay up. If, through lack of intelligence, not to mention ingratitude, the capitalist countries refused to pay up, then the unrelenting dialectic of their own system would see to it that they are asphyxiated. I'm not sure why he thinks that. It is a fact that the young nations attract little private capital. A number of reasons justify and explain these reservations on the part of the monopolies. As soon as the capitalists know, and they are obviously the first to know, that their government is preparing to decolonize, they hasten to withdraw all their capital from the colony. This spectacular flight of capital is one of the most constant phenomena of decolonization, because the capitalists, they're afraid of nationalization, right? They don't want their shit, which is only their shit by force of arms, right? But their nominal private property holdings, they don't want those to be taken over by the people who actually live wherever they have these holdings. They would consider that theft. They don't want it to happen. So better to back off, sell it, put it in the hands of some local who they can control from a distance. At least not continue to invest in a place where it's not safe. They want a dictatorial regime. They want a colonial regime. They want rule by military force in the end, because that's how they're going to guarantee their labor force. That's how they're going to guarantee the consistency of their private property. Okay, and then the last one, pages 61 to 62, which I think gives Fanon's sort of closing position on the response to global imperialism. The third world expects from those who have kept it in slavery for centuries for them to help rehabilitate man and ensure his triumph everywhere once and for all. But it is obvious we are not so naive as to think that this will be achieved with the cooperation and goodwill of the European governments. This colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality, will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on colonial issues. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, put on their thinking caps, and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty. So what this means is that the exploited classes, and here I would include the United States, of the so-called first world, need to break that imaginary identification with their masters, which is often used in order to throw them into war against other peoples, and often colonial war too. I mean, I would say, you know, the kind of wars we have going on across the Middle East and in Africa, these are like effectively colonial wars we're still involved in, killing people who live in an economic situation which is radically different from the one that we live in, radically backwards, where resources are being extracted by capitalist companies, and where violent rule by usually proxy governments is carried out. We need to break our identification with our masters, the capitalists and the governments, and instead learn that the proper alliance is with the oppressed of the rest of the world. Oh, and okay, so how do we turn this into questions? There's all kinds of shit to think about here. Do you really think, I mean, I imagine that most of us are raised to believe that nonviolent solutions are always superior. And maybe even to think that nonviolent responses are required for a truly ethical person. But if you think about the most extreme circumstances, could you really expect the Taino people or the other Carib peoples or the Mexican people to respond non-violently to the conquistadors? That doesn't seem like an option. Do you really expect colonized people, the Algerians, for example, or the Vietnamese, to respond to their colonial masters who have been raping them, stealing from them, taking over the best land, periodically killing tens of thousands of people in, what did I call them? Precautionary massacres? Do you really think that in a situation like that, where the life of the lowest class is held so cheap, do you really think that nonviolent response is possible? And if I'm convincing you that it's not, then don't you have to expect violent responses on the part of oppressed peoples everywhere? Next, what do you think about this idea about the alliance between the oppressed of the first world and the oppressed of the third world? Isn't it true that I have more in common with a working person from Russia or a working person from Iraq than I do with Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or like whatever emir in Saudi Arabia? Don't I have more in common with regular working folk, and therefore shouldn't I help to form an alliance with them?